I think that Ireland as a country has changed so much in the last couple of decades. Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland, the equal marriage referendum, the bodily autonomy referendum, which both happened in the south of Ireland, and made gay marriage legally possible, which made abortion legally possible. As well, there's an investigation into some of the past as the grip of some of the institution of the Catholic Church loosens. Stories are coming out about the mother and baby homes, the laundries, the Magdalene laundries. And so I think there's both of the referendums were won really by the power of personal story and personal narrative. And I think that in the island, north and south, there's been a great rejection of shame. A lot of the things that people might have left unsaid, they're saying, and they're starting to speak those stories. One of the most famous lines of poetry, Seamus Heaney, whatever you say nothing, which was actually taken from an IRA campaign. That was very much when I was growing up, you would batten down the hatches. You know, you would not say things, you would keep things unsaid. And I think as well, in the 25 years since the Good Friday Agreement and the Troubles ended, similarly, there's been a reassessment of those times we lived through. There's been an acknowledgement that there were more than one story, one narrative. And people like Louise Kennedy, whose Trespasses has just been published this year, an extraordinary novel. Anna Burns' masterpiece, Milkman. Paul McVeigh writing his book The Good Son about a young boy questioning his sexuality. That we have all this plurality of narratives and stories. It's happening across fiction. I think for a long time poetry has had, poetry was what the world knew Northern Ireland especially for. But these days we have fiction, we have short fiction, we have non-fiction. It seems that writers across a lot of forums are telling stories that haven't been told before. And I think that the success of some writers emboldens others. It seems that there's a proverb, there's a saying that a rising tide lifts all boats. And I think that feels very true as a writer coming from Northern Ireland. There's the idea that we're all learning from each other, learning from what other people do, emboldened by each other. And so I think something of all those circumstances makes for something of a golden age of Irish fiction. I think that Ireland, as opposed to, say, England, has a very thriving culture of the small press as well, the small magazine. There are magazines like The Stinging Fly, like The Tangerine, like Banshee. There are lots of magazines that provide an outlet, that provide somewhere for poets to publish, for short story writers to publish. And so I think that's a really healthy part of the ecosystem as well.
If somebody hasn't read anything from the island, who would you like to recommend for the first book?
For the first book, okay. That's such a good question. Well, published this year, and already one of my favourite books this year is Louise Kennedy's Trespasses. It's a story, in some ways it's quite a traditional story because it's a love affair between a young Catholic girl and an older Protestant barrister. But I read that book and thought I had such a visceral response to it. That book, it will leave you heartbroken, and it captures so well the atmosphere of Belfast in the 70s, a decade before I was born, but I feel it, I feel that that's what it was like. That's what I remember from the 80s as well. So I think that's a really good place to start. I also think when you've done that, maybe you watch some of Lisa McGee's Dairy Girls for light relief. And then I would really recommend the stories of Wendy Erskine. Wendy Erskine has published 2 collections with the Singing Fly Press. The second came out this year. And she happens to be my 6th form English teacher. And so it was one of the great joys of my life as a writer and as an editor to publish one of her first ever stories in my anthology, Being Various. She wrote a brilliant story called Mikey Mulholland, which people can read because it's translated into Polish. And I think she's one of our finest contemporary short story writers on the whole island of Ireland. And her dialogue is brilliant, and they're acerbic, and they're rich, and they're funny, and they're moving as well. So I would recommend that would be a good place to start.
And not use this.
Oh, I don't think I could use it to recommend my own, but Agazano, I know, has done a wonderful job of translating them from what I can gather. And so, yeah, I would hope that someone would pick up my volume as well. I love the fact that in Polish, they're published together. Yeah. The two collections that I wrote, Multitudes and Intimacies, they both have 11 stories. They're both narrated by or about young women. To me, they felt very much sister collections. They felt like they belonged together. And so they will be published in one volume.